Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. There's always a great welcome, and it's always a privilege to come and talk to you. Can I ask, I think this might be my third or fourth time here, so any of you have been at any of the other Civil War lectures? Can you put up your hand? Well, there's some gluttons for punishment out there. So there is. I think Ronnie has the best idea to run for his life and get out of it. But listen, it's wonderful to be here, and I hope that you enjoy what we're going to talk about today. This morning, I want to look together at death and Civil War medicine. And I thought that I would speak about something that was uplifting and would brighten your day. So if you're prepared to be cheered up, just listen. Many historians, they focus on the military battles of the Civil War. But there's also a battle that was fought, not to take away life, but to save life, to preserve life. And I'm a social historian. I love to find out about ordinary people. I love to find out about what went on just with the ordinary soldier. Not so much even the big battles, but just what it was like to live there. Now, can I ask you, has anybody here, is anybody from a medical background at all? No? No? That's always good when you're about to do that. I would like to disclose to you, I'm not from a medical background. I used to work in Grantia Hospital many years ago, but I forgot everything that I learnt then. But I'm looking at this from a purely historical viewpoint. I'd also like to warn you that maybe some things that we're going to talk about and look at today might be a wee bit gruesome. So if you're willing to look at some gore, and if you're prepared to be shocked, we'll continue on. At any time, if you don't want to look at it, close your eyes. That's my advice. The United States of America was a very different army in the years preceding the Civil War. In 1860, the strength of the United States Army stood around just 15,000 men. And these soldiers were stationed in various forts like Fort Sumter and Fort Leavenworth. However, the majority of the army was spread out among isolated outposts to guard 8,000 miles of the western frontier. The army only employed 30 surgeons to look after that 15,000 men. Healthcare for the men was very rudimentary, and these surgeons were scattered amongst the various forts and outposts. But all that was about to change at the outbreak of the war. On the 12th of April 1861, South Carolinian forces bombarded the federal fort at Fort Sumter. On the 15th of April, President Abraham Lincoln called for an enlistment of 75,000 volunteers, soldiers called to suppress the rebellion in the South. The ranks in the Union Army would swell to 2.1 million men in uniform. In the South, 3 out of every 4 military-aged men enlisted, and the size of the Confederate Army varied, but it was estimated around 880,000 men who fought to preserve, who fought for secession. As the war progressed, the number of surgeons also increased to 11,000 in the Union Army and 4,000 in the Confederate Army. And these surgeons had to meet the needs of 4 long, terrible years of slaughter. Now, Lincoln nor the politicians on both sides of the conflict understood fully the terrible war that was about to begin. Lincoln's new 75,000 volunteers enlistment papers only lasted initially for 3 months, and both sides expected a swift and decisive war. The Cavalier Southerners, they believed that the North had no stomach for a fight. And the North, they believed that their industrial power, their numerical advantages would crush the South. But they got it very wrong. Instead, 4 long, bloody years of slaughter and carnage followed. And some historians have called it the last old war and the first modern war, because technology was to play a role in this carnage. New accurate weapons would kill at greater distances. Railroads were used to move troops into action. The telegraph was used to communicate between commanders at the front and their respective governments in Washington and in Richmond. For the first time in history, ironclad battleships were employed in warfare. In 1889, William Fox and Thomas Leonard estimated that between 620,000 soldiers were killed in the war. However, in 2011, David Hacker argued that a more accurate figure was 850,000 military fatalities. Now, historian Drew Gilton-Faust pointed out that these numbers do not include civilian deaths. For example, the 85-year-old widow, Judith Henry, who was killed in her bed by an artillery shell at the First Battle of Bull Run in 1861. Or the 20-year-old Jenny Wade, who was killed in her kitchen at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863 while she was baking in her kitchen. So the truth is that we will never know how many people were really killed during the American Civil War. The war produced around 1.5 million casualties. They were recorded during the Civil War. 1 in 13 soldiers would have a limb amputated. And many of these soldiers were manual workers before the war. They worked in factories, they worked as labourers, and in the South, 69% of Confederate soldiers were farmers. So disability and disfigurement left these male breadwinners out of a job when they returned to their previous occupations. And many families would fall on hard times and slip into destitution. Most soldiers during the Civil War did not die on the battlefield. And yes, the fighting during the war was terrible, and thousands died in combat. At the Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862, 13,000 were killed. The famous General Albert Sidney Johnson bled to death from a leg wound while he all the time carried a tourniquet in his pocket that could have saved his life. At Antietam in September of 1862, 3,650 were killed, including 6 generals. At the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, 7,058 soldiers died. One regiment, the 11th Mississippi, suffered a 100% casualty rate during the battle. But with that said, as terrible as Civil War battles were, twice as many soldiers died of disease than on the battlefield. Historian Bell Wiley carried out a study of the common soldier during the Civil War. The average soldier was a native-born American, although Irish, German, British soldiers were all part of the Civil War, just as so many nationalities would come together to fight for their new country. The most common ethnic group during the Civil War was white males. They were aged between 18 and 29. The Civil War soldier weighed just a little over 10 stones, and he was roughly 5 feet 8 inches tall. Most soldiers worked on farms before the war. At the beginning of the Civil War, young men, farm boys, who lived in isolated rural communities were brought together for the first time. They were brought together with city boys from crowded places like New York. And these young men that lived in the country were used to wide open spaces. And this was in contrast to these people that they were brought together with. For many, this was the first time that they were away from home, and their immunity levels were underdeveloped. When these young men were packed together into crowded camps with recruits from dirty cities like New York and New Orleans, they came in contact for the first time with all sorts of diseases for the first time. Childhood diseases such as measles especially ravaged the Confederate Army. And measles during the Civil War had roughly an 11% mortality rate. One Confederate surgeon wrote, about 100 sick men crowded into a room, 60 by 100 feet, in all stages of measles. The poor boys are lying on the hard floor, with only 1 or 2 blankets under them, not even straw, and anything that they could find as a pillow. Many sick and vomiting, many already showing unmistakable signs of blood poisoning. As well, during the camps there was outbreaks of consumption, also known as tuberculosis today. There was outbreaks of yellow fever caused high fevers and black vomit. Smallpox ravaged the camps. A vaccine had been developed that helped prevent widespread epidemics. Unfortunately, the vaccine was primitive and dangerous, and Civil War soldiers dreaded being inoculated. Typhoid, cholera spread throughout the camps, and this was caused by fecal matter in the drinking water. Malaria was also caused by mosquitoes. Soldiers were encouraged to drink quinine to try and combat malaria, and the only way that they could get the soldiers to take this was to mix it with whiskey. Robert E. Lee wrote to his wife Mary on the 24th of July 1861, "We have a great deal of sickness amongst the soldiers, and now those on the sick list would form an army. The measles is still amongst them, though I hope it is dying out. But it is a disease which, though light in childhood, is severe in manhood, and prepares the system for other attacks. Constant cold rains, with no shelter but tents, have aggravated it." Army surgeons called diseases in the training and muster camps crowd poisoning, and they attributed these diseases, these levels of epidemics, to anxiety and homesickness. It was believed that the troops were weakened by emotional upset, making them disposed to dangerous miasmas in the air. And mortality rates would rise due to what they called nostalgia. We would call it clinical depression today. And records show that people have died of what they called nostalgia. Scott Grug wrote that a paper on the Union Army numbered 108,000 men. In reality, were on paper in the Union Army. However, 80,000 men were only fit for duty at one time. Accounts indicate that on average Confederate soldiers would have 6 bouts of chronic illness during their service. There were 2 chief causes of death during the Civil War. This was chronic diarrhea and dysentery. Surgeons routinely grouped these 2 diseases together because they didn't have the skills or means to distinguish one from the other, and it was known as flux or bloody flux in the case of dysentery. It caused stomach cramps, high fever, joint pain, weight loss, fatigue, and these also accompanied these diseases. Outbreaks of chronic diarrhea and dysentery increased as the war progressed and peaked during the spring and summer months. The Federal Army reported 1.7 million cases of diarrhea and dysentery over the 4 years of the war, and 44,500 deaths due to simple diarrhea. Historian Gilpin Frost wrote that nearly 3/4 of the Union soldiers suffered from serious bowel complaints in every year of the war, and that by 1865 the sick rate for diarrhea and dysentery was 905 soldiers per 1,000. That's big numbers. Of soldiers suffering from chronic diarrhea, 162 out of every 1,000 died. Of soldiers suffering from dysentery, 126 of every 1,000 died. In 1862, 36,500 out of 49,000 Confederate soldiers fighting in eastern Virginia suffered from diarrhea and dysentery, and over 10,000 of these troops were hospitalized and while they were in hospital, they suffered from a 10% mortality rate. Diarrhea and dysentery were treated with usually a tincture of opium, and this was a mixture of opium, whiskey and water. Another drug called caramel and blue mass were cure-alls. They contained mercury, and these drugs caused extreme salivation in the mouth. They inflamed the gums, they loosened teeth, they caused ulcers, and sometimes they would form around the mouth, and sometimes the mercury would eat away the bone and tissue, causing horrendous facial disfigurations. The primary cause of diarrhea and dysentery and typhoid and cholera was fecal matter contained in the camp water supplies. Wells were dug too close to latrines. Freshwater streams were contaminated by soldiers defecating and urinating in them. Civil War camps were filthy places. They had a reputation of stinking to the high heavens. One source said that you could smell the army before you saw it. I wonder, can you try to imagine thousands of men closely packed together? As well as men, there was also animals, horses for the cavalry and officers, mules to carry wagons. Cattle were driven alongside the army as a source of fresh meat. And in these camps, animal feces would mix with mud and dust, and this clung up in the air, be churned around the air. The carcasses of butchered animals were decomposing in the sun. There was discarded, rotting food lying around. The men lived with lice and fleas known as camp itch. Flies, rats and mosquitoes also infested these camps, spreading disease. Flies would land on animal feces and then land on food and contaminate it. Historian C.S. Gwynn wrote a description of a Confederate General Stonewall Jackson's camp at Manassas. The men lived in huge conical shelby tents designed to fit 12 men. They often held 20. Their canvas roofs and walls were often covered with black flies and mosquitoes. They called them gall nippers. There was blood-sucking buffalo ants, and they were divided that would dive into ears and the nose. Blowflies, chiggers, fleas, and worst of all, lice called greybacks roamed freely and took up residence. As always, there was disease. Diarrhea and dysentery were universal. Men who had never seen combat, nor ever would see combat, were dying at a steady rate. Army regulations stated that latrines were to be dug 30 feet away from all living areas. They were to be covered daily with a layer of fresh soil. However, in practice, the soldiers often relieved themselves and defecated wherever they could find, normally as close to their tent as they could. A regular soldier could be placed on a charge in the regular army for this, but in the new volunteer regiments, this wasn't the case. Robert E. Lee wrote to his wife Mary on the 17th of September 1861, "Our poor sick, I know how they suffer. They suffer much. They bring it on themselves by not doing what they are told. They are worse than children, for the latter can be forced." A soldier's personal hygiene was also very wanting. They rarely washed, not knowing about bacteria or germ theory. They would rarely wash their hands, even after going to the loo. A piece of bread or dirt would be used to clean and wipe away their utensils and plate. Soldiers wore the same heavy woolen uniforms in winter and in summer, and these uniforms were soaked with sweat and caked with a mixture of dust and fecal matter picked up from the ground. They were eaten alive with lice that spread typhus, perhaps to an extent that their wardrobe consisted only of a shirt, an extra shirt, and a pair of socks. Soldiers carried their meat rations in cloth knapsacks. But like this. and their meat ration would leak into the bottom of these knapsacks. Fresh meat carried in cloth. And it was known that these knapsacks stunk and were covered in blood. They became rancid breeding grounds for bacteria. A correspondent for Baltimore, America, wrote down a description of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. They were the roughest set of creatures I ever saw. Their features, hair and clothing matted with dirt and filth, and the scratching they kept up gave warrant of vermin in abundance. Many were without shoes, their uniforms so tattered that they barely held together. They stunk so badly. Many had not even removed their clothing legs. It was said that you could smell the Army of Virginia before you could see it. The first major engagement of the war was fought on the 21st of July 1861, and it was known as Bull Run, or also known as First Manassas. The armies that clashed there were inadequately prepared for what was about to happen, and so was their medical provisions. At the outbreak of the war, Clement Finlay directed the medical department in the United States Army. And Finlay, like so many of the generals during the Civil War, was stuck in a Napoleonic age. Bull Run turned into an embarrassing moment for the Union Army. It exposed inadequate medical provisions for their army. On the 16th of July, the largest army ever amassed in American history left Washington on a two-day march to Manassas Junction. There, an army of 3,000 Confederate soldiers were assembled, led by Generals Joseph E. Johnson and P.G.T. Beauregard. Most of the Union Army's medical supplies, however, were left in wagons still in Washington. Furthermore, medical supplies were lost along the road to Manassas. There was inadequate provision to transport the wounded from the battlefield. It was left to drummer boys and the regimental band to act as stretchers bearers. No arrangements were made to establish a field hospital, and volunteer regiments were raised, and they raised their own surgeons. And these were civilian doctors who'd never experienced treating battlefield trauma before. With the first hours of fighting, hundreds of men were wounded. There was utter confusion in the battlefield. Some Confederates who were still wearing blue uniforms were able to march within 75 meters of the Federal lines before firing into them at point-blank range. Men were dying. The numbers of wounded were mounting. It became clear that the Union Medical Corps was overwhelmed. The Medical Corps was unable to deal with 1,500 casualties from the battle. Some regiments had gone to war with no surgeons or doctors. Of those regiments that did, the surgeons, some were only stewards who volunteered to become surgeon for the regiment. The 1st Connecticut Volunteer Regiment numbered 700 men. They had one horse-drawn ambulance, 2 tents, and no litter bearers to carry the wounded off the field. They also had no medical supplies. Army Director William S. King wrote that a hospital established by one regiment refused to receive certain wounded men because they were from another regiment. They were very nice, weren't they? Union volunteer nurse Emma Edmonds wrote about the carnage in her diary. Still, the battle continued without cessation. The grape and canister fill the air as they go screaming on their fearful errand. The sight of the field is perfectly appalling. Men tossing their arms wildly, calling for help. There they lie bleeding, torn and mangled. Torn and mangled legs and arms and bodies are crushed and broken as if smitten by thunderbolts. The ground is crimsoned with blood. It is terrible to witness. Surgeon Frank H. Hamilton wrote, 3 or 4 soldiers had balls passed through them and they had to walk 2 or 3 miles for help. By 4 p.m, the Union Army was in full retreat. Soldiers panicked and ran for their lives. As they did so, soldiers commandeered the ambulances and wagons that were to be used to carry the wounded away. Some medical officers abandoned their patients and ran, while some stayed at their posts, working as best as they could in makeshift aid stations. One medical officer wrote that there were no sponges, no bandages, no lint, and little water. The next day the weather turned cold and the surgeons returned to Washington, leaving the bulk of the wounded abandoned in a hope that the Confederate doctors would treat them. Some surgeons volunteered to stay with 500 wounded men still lying in a makeshift hospital in a local church. The walking wounded were left to walk over 20 miles back to Washington themselves. One soldier managed to walk to Washington despite having his arm blown off. Another walked back despite being shot in the cheek and the jaw and the tongue. President Lincoln relieved the commander of the Union Army, General McDowell, of his command, and he appointed a new commander, General George B. McClellan. McClellan would become the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Little Mac, as his men fondly called him, wasn't much of a fighter. He wasn't much of a commander. He was very indecisive in battle, but he was a natural-born organizer. So McClellan implemented sweeping changes across the army. A new Surgeon General was also appointed, William Alexander Hammond. Hammond would introduce changes to the medical corps. Hammond was only 33 years of age, and he actually received great resistance from the older doctors that would eventually cause him to lose his position. The first thing that Hammond did was to clean up the army camps that were the cause of so much disease. Hammond ordered that tents were placed to allow fresh air to circulate around the camps. He ordered that camps were not to be established near swampy ground or stagnant water and away from areas that would harbour vermin. It all seems like common sense to us now, doesn't it? But back then it wasn't. Hammond only hired professional surgeons with medical training. In the 19th century, a doctor's training only consisted of 2 years of study. In the first year, medical students would pay to observe operations. Then in their second year, they would pay again to observe exactly the same set of operations. They would then sit an exam, and if they passed it, they were a doctor. Other older doctors were taken on as apprentices who would shadow an old country doctor and follow him around. By second Bull Runner, second Manassas, between the 28th and 30th of August, this turned into another Union defeat. After the fighting had ended, 3,000 wounded men were left lying on the battlefield. There was not enough ambulances to collect the wounded, so the Surgeon General, William Hammond, procured private carriages and wagons to help with the evacuation of the wounded. The civilian contractors that he hired to do the job stole the medical supplies that were in the carts. They also refused to pick up certain members of the wounded men that were lying on the ground. It would take 3 days to remove all the wounded from the battlefield. Medical officer W.W. King wrote about what he witnessed at Second Bull Run. The third day after the battle, I passed such a night as I never before experienced in my life. Long trains of ambulances arrived carrying wounded men from the field of battle back to Washington. And there were only but 4 surgeons to look after them. 50 poor fellows, thirsty fellows, were crying for water. 50 more were crying out in pain with the jolting ride of 9 miles. Most of them had not eaten for 2 to 3 days. The Surgeon General then turned to another brilliant young officer, Jonathan Letterman. Letterman was only 37 years of age, and he turned to him to address the medical failings of the Union Army of the Potomac. Jonathan Letterman would redefine battlefield medicine and introduce a triage system that is still used today by Army medics. Letterman introduced a new system of evacuating wounded from the battlefield. General McClellan issued Order 147, and this order dealt with the evacuation of wounded from the battlefield. A dedicated ambulance service was established. It was manned by trained soldiers. Each ambulance had a driver and 2 helpers. These ambulances were under direct command of the Medical Corps. Line officers had a history in the past of using these ambulances for their personal needs, and it was now made an offence to interfere with an ambulance, for which a line officer could be arrested. As an order was passed prohibiting soldiers leaving the line to carry wounded friends off the field, troops were only willing to leave the battle and to carry a friend back to an aid station. And when they made it to the aid station, they didn't return to the front line. Now only ambulance personnel were permitted to evacuate wounded from the field. If you can imagine someone shot and 4 of his friends takes him to get treatment, well, that's 5 men off your firing line. Letterman also introduced purpose-built ambulances to carry the wounded. Each ambulance had a suspended suspension which was mounted on springs to ensure the comfort of the wounded. Ambulances were made bigger to carry more wounded. They also carried 2 litters that were slung on each side of the ambulance. They also carried brandy, which is always good, hot broth and water. Under Letterman's new orderly system, wounded men would now be lifted by trained ambulance personnel. They would then be transported to an aid station that was positioned just behind the fighting. At the aid station, an assistant surgeon would assess the wounds and administer first aid and stabilise the wounded for transport. Some soldiers would be treated and sent back to the line, while others would be transported to a nearby field hospital. Once wounded men were well enough then to travel, they would be transported by train or steamer to a general hospital. And each of these steps ensured that the wounded man received treatment quickly. And this in turn gave him a greater chance of survival and full recovery. When Letterman assumed command, he found the medical department in a terrible shape. Much of the Army's medical supplies had been abandoned as a result of the many Union defeats that the Union Army had endured. Surgeon General Hammond gave Letterman full authority to draw down much needed supplies, to cut through the red tape of the Union quartermasters and get the supplies to the surgeons. Letterman requested 1,000 tents and 200 ambulances. He also requested that more doctors and nurses were hired. His rationale was that if soldiers were afforded proper medical care and nursed back to health, they could rejoin the army and rejoin the fight. Letterman noted that the army was ravished with scurvy and malnutrition. Soldiers' diet consisted of hardtack biscuits, and in some cases these biscuits were covered in mould when they became damp. They were infested with weevils, like maggots. They would eat dried jerky, beef jerky, and dried vegetables. Due to the effort of Letterman, the army was supplied with fresh potatoes, vegetables, onions, cabbage, carrots, tomatoes, and squash. The army was also supplied with freshly baked bread and meat. He also improved the soldiers' camp life by allowing soldiers to sleep until sunrise and have breakfast before they stood to. Soldiers were given time to wash themselves and encouraged to bathe. He also limited drill to 2 45-minute sessions per day. He ordered that pits be dug in camp for camp refuge and latrines. And one important change was the commanding general of the Army of Potomac, George McClellan, worked with Letterman and Hammond to improve the Army's health. McClellan issued a series of orders: Special Order 197 and General Orders 193 and 150 to address cleanliness and fight disease in the Union Army. Letterman also made each regiment's commanding officer, and this was very important, responsible for inspecting and enforcing these new arrangements, and he introduced accountability. Ultimately, the work that Hammond, McClellan and Letterman did would save lives. You have to admire this man for his sideburns and nothing else. In the South, there's another story. Confederate President Jefferson Davis was faced with creating a medical corps from scratch. And Davis turned to this man, a former US Army surgeon called Samuel Preston Moore, who had served with the Mexican War in 1846 to 1848. And Moore resigned his commission when his state, South Carolina, succeeded. And on the 30th of July 1861, Samuel Moore was appointed acting Surgeon General of the Confederate States Army. Establishing a Confederate medical corps, Moore was no easy task. Most of the doctors who served in the Confederacy were civilian practitioners. They had no military experience or experience of battlefield medicine or trauma. Moore set up examining boards for surgeons. The Confederacy also had limited medical supplies. Abraham Lincoln had ordered a blockade of southern ports on the 19th of April 1861. Lincoln wanted to weaken the southern states through a war of attrition. The blockades made importing drugs and medical supplies from Europe very difficult. Furthermore, the South had very little laboratories, can't say that word, my teeth is out today, to manufacture its own drugs. Moore had faced having to set up laboratories to manufacture medicines and factories to manufacture medical supplies. These factories could never supply the Confederacy with enough material. There was always serious shortages of drugs like quinine to treat malaria. Ironically, the largest supplier of the Confederate Army was the Union Army. Confederates were more than happy to repurpose Union medicines, medical supplies, weapons and equipment. Even the commanding general of the Confederacy, Robert E. Lee, was riding around in a wagon with a large US painted on the side of it. In 1862, Surgeon General Moore turned to Dr. Francis Poacher to write a handbook of natural plants and herbs that Confederate doctors could use to treat their patients. Moore also commissioned an instruction book to aid civilian surgeons in treating battlefield wounds. The Confederate Army had some very good hospitals. Chimborazo Hospital was located in Richmond and was the largest hospital during the Civil War. But the issue for the Confederate Army was transporting their wounded back to friendly lines. At Gettysburg, the wagon train of ambulances carrying Confederate wounded was said to be 17 miles long. A number of these men were groaning in agony with every bump of the road. Many of the Confederate wounded never made it back to the South. They died and were buried en route. Today we think of medical staff in terms of fighting to save lives. But surgeons during the Civil War have often been accused and given a very bad press of on gentlemanly conduct. They were called butchers and sawbones. Now, Hollywood has done much to paint a picture of surgeons who heartlessly hack off limbs for no good reason at all. Poor wounded soldiers were portrayed lying fully conscious while biting down on pieces of wood or bullets as their arm or leg is hacked off. It might then surprise you to find out that during the Civil War, surgeons used anaesthetic in most of their operations. Both ether and chloroform were in good supply, and it was relatively easy to manufacture. There was instances when surgeons didn't use anaesthetics. This was a given in the case of severe facial wounds, where there was a danger of obstruction to the breathing. Operations may have happened without anaesthetic, but it wasn't the norm. George Wunderlich stated that 75% of wounds to the arm were to the arm to the legs. 76% of wounds were caused by mini balls. Now, a mini ball, this is a mini ball here, was a heavy, soft lead bullet. It weighed roughly 1 ounce. This bullet travelled a lot slower than modern munitions of the time, and it flattened and tumbled inside the victim. They created the most terrible wounds. Its victim had a small entrance wound and a massive, great big exit wound. They shattered bone on impact. And these particles of shattered bone pieces, these pieces of bullet fragments and dirty cloth from their uniforms, caused a real danger to the wounded man. If these fragments were not removed by the surgeon, the wound would turn gangrenous. And amputation was the most common operation performed during the Civil War. It was also the fastest and most efficient way of treating hundreds of wounded. Eben E. Smith, you see him here, on the 16th of August 1648, Union soldier Eben E. Smith was wounded during the Second Battle of Deep Bottom on the outskirts of Richmond. He was shot in the right thigh. Following the injury, Smith underwent a series of 3 amputations on his leg. The final amputation occurred at the hip joint itself. This was an operation that was reportedly performed only 66 times on Union soldiers during the war, and out of that number, 55 of these soldiers died. Smith eventually returned home to Hancock County and settled in Franklin. He died in 1921 at the age of 76. The surgeon had done his job. He had saved this man's life. George Stevens, a Union soldier, wrote, "We are almost worked to death. My feet are terribly swollen, yet we cannot rest, for there are so many fellows who are suffering. All yesterday I worked at the operating table, yet there are hundreds of cases of amputations waiting for me. Poor fellows come and beg, almost on their knees, for their first chance to have their arm taken off. It is a scene of horror, such as I have never saw. God forbid that I should ever see another." It might surprise you to learn that bullet wounds don't generate a lot of blood, and so there is not enough blood to flush out the foreign fragments from the wound. Amputation opened up a large area that allowed blood to free flowly and clean out the wound. It was also the quickest method to remove contamination in foreign bodies from the wound. It also encouraged white blood cells to fight infections. And wounds were sewn up with silk thread. In the Confederacy, due to a shortage of silk, wounds were sewn with horsehair, which proved to be actually more sterile, because the horsehair was actually boiled first before it was used. 68% of lower limb amputations survived. 76% of upper arm amputations survived. And these figures were achieved without antibiotics and a limited use of antiseptics. It might also surprise you to find out that during the Civil War, hospitals were actually relatively clean. However, with no understanding of germ theory, unsterile surgical operations were performed. Doctors would use a dirty finger to probe a wound for loose fragments. Surgical implements were not washed, let alone sterilised between patients. The same saw would be used on multiple patients, one after the other. Doctors wiped bloodied hands on aprons and would only wash their implements at the end of the day. Antiseptics like iodine and bromide and surgical alcohol were used to tackle mild infections. It should be noted that Civil War medicine had no idea of germ theory. It was not understood during the Civil War. But what they did know is that antiseptics worked. They didn't know how they worked, but they knew that they worked. Confederate General John Gordon was wounded at the Battle of Antietam. His wife was advised to wash his wound with iodine, which is still used today, daily. And so iodine was also used to combat hospital gangrene. It might shock you to find out that bandages during the Civil War were reused. They were taken from one person and put on another. Scott's Military Dictionary of 1860 listed 3 types of antiseptic. One was heat, one was clean water, and one was sunlight. Bandages were first washed in soap, then they were boiled and hung out to dry in direct sunlight. This direct sunlight somewhat sterilised them. They didn't realise this, but it somewhat sterilised them by the ultraviolet radiation from the sun. I don't know about you, but I certainly would have not liked to take sick during the Civil War. So thank you very much.